Captain America the First Avenger may have been the MCU film I was the most excited to see before release. I was a big comic fan at the time, and as a young kid, this guy with a shield who fights spies and Nazis was pretty cool, so imagine my excitement when this film was announced. I remember being a bit unsure when Chris Evans was cast, who I wasn't super familiar with, besides his role as the Human Torch in the early 2000s Fantastic Four films, but not unlike Robert Downey Jr., they hit a home run with the casting, and Chris Evans proved to be a solid choice for Captain America. Captain America's had several adaptations before the MCU, not too dissimilar to the Hulk, but Captain America's original adaptations had a bit of a hard time adapting the character to the screen. First, we had a serial, which was a 15-part episodic miniseries. Essentially, in this film, Captain America's lore is thrown out and replaced with Grant Gardner, a district attorney who doubles as Captain America, a non-shield wielding version that needs to stop a giant evil vibrator that will destroy a building and kill people. It's 3 hours long and Marvel's only big screen appearance until Howard the Duck almost 50 years later. The 70s version is a duology of films where Steve Rogers is a biker who lives a breezy California lifestyle until he takes a serum called Flag, which gives him enhanced strength, speed, etc. Much like the 1940s versions, these films kind of miss the point of the character and throw out most of the lore. However, this one's closer to the comics, bar the surfer bro personality, clear shield, surfer van, and Evel Knievel costume. In the 1990s, the infamous schlockmeister Albert Pune adapted Captain America, and it's the most accurate version, at least attempting to adapt the comic to the screen. I would say it's accurate in the same way the 1989 Batman is accurate, where all the elements are there, just remixed for the screen adaptation. It's probably the best Captain America movie up to this point, but still has a low budget, keeping it from being as well regarded as something like Batman, and some of the acting and scenarios are a little bit choppy, but overall it's okay. Captain America the First Avenger follows Steve Rogers, who's a scrawny man who wants nothing more than to fight for his country, but unfortunately for him, he's too weak and is asthmatic. This is when he meets the scientist Abraham Erskine, who's looking for ideal candidates for a super soldier serum he was developing. After a trial period, Steve is selected, but while he's being enhanced, Abraham is killed, his formula dying with him. The army is unsure what to do with Steve, so they make him a USO exhibit, but eventually after learning his best friend Bucky is captured, Steve goes rogue and fully embraces his new identity as Captain America. Meanwhile, the Red Skull, Abraham's original test subject, has found the Tesseract, which is a mystical MacGuffin that has powers Red Skull hopes to harness. After infiltrating several Hydra bases, the offshoot of the Nazis helmed by Red Skull, Captain America's friend Bucky is killed, and this eventually leads to a final confrontation with Red Skull. Captain America gets the best of him, but is forced to sink Red Skull's airplane into the ice, where he would be frozen until the upcoming Avengers movie at the time. Obviously, as I stated, Captain America has had several films before the first Avenger, but none that were really large-scale Hollywood blockbusters like this was. That process started in the late 90s, but nothing would materialize due to a lawsuit with Joe Simon over the ownership of Captain America, Joe Simon being one of the original creators of Captain America along with Jack Kirby. Following the conclusion of that lawsuit, Marvel thought about licensing the rights to Warner Brothers, but would eventually decide to do the film themselves. Joe Johnston was approached to direct, who worked on another superhero period piece, The Rocketeer, and I think that was a pretty wise choice for Marvel. Chris Evans would be cast, and like I said, would be a bit of a worrisome casting choice, but after the movie's release was pretty well embraced in the role. Captain America is pretty similar to his comics counterpart, with him essentially being a wannabe soldier with a good heart who only wants what's best for the little man, and uses his enhanced powers to essentially fight bullies and bad guys. In the comics, he wouldn't be frozen like in the films and fight into the 1950s until a complex series of retcons I may make into its own video eventually. But anyhow, after the retcons, he's frozen and revived by the Avengers for the Avengers comic, not too unlike his film counterpart, which would see him canonically on ice until the Avengers film. Bucky is aged up from the comics, going from a kid to an adult. The dynamic between him and Captain America has changed a bit too, having Bucky stand up for Cap when he is weak and defenseless, and eventually when evolving into his super form, still having his back and rooting for him. This is also a good motivator for Steve when he's seemingly killed off towards the end of the film. Peggy, like Bucky, is support and motivation for Steve. She is probably the most proactive love interest to this point in the MCU, and her and Steve's doomed love makes for a somewhat compelling arc. The Howling Commandos, like the Warriors 3 and Thor, are pretty much background characters, but it's fun to have them in the MCU, despite it being an extended cameo. In the comics, they worked with Nick Fury extensively during the Korean War. Red Skull wants to harness the power of the Tesseract, much like Steve, who is also enhanced by Super Soldier Serum. Much like in the comics, he's the leader of Hydra and is an evil Nazi. That's pretty much all you need to know about him. Zola is a scientist that works for the Red Skull in the comics. He's most famous for being a weird evil robot, but in this film he's just a normal scientist. His weird evil robot phase coming later in the timeline. The Tesseract is a magical MacGuffin that Red Skull uses to power his devices and weapons he was creating. On a macro level, it's the first Infinity Stone we see, the Space Stone. I'm not going to go into too much detail explaining what the Infinity Stones are at this point, but just understand they'll be pretty pivotal to the Infinity Saga as a whole. Captain America has a shield given to him by Howard Stark, Tony Stark's father. It is invulnerable to most things, being made of vibranium, a nearly indestructible metal. He can throw it and it'll come back. It's a pretty simple concept and pretty similar to the comics adaptations. Captain America has a suit he was using for the USO show that would inspire his look from the actual costumes along the way. It comes equipped with a shield, and it's pretty much a straight reference to Captain America's Golden Age comic suit, mixed with a little bit of the Silver Age suit as well. Once Captain America actually goes into the field, he's outfitted with a more tactical suit. It's a nice homage to the comics, but is a more unique design, informed by a military uniform from World War II. I'd most closely compare it to Ultimate Comics' adaptation of Captain America and his World War II suit from the comics. For this video, I read Captain America Comics 1-4 through Marvel Masterworks. It's an interesting read, but is more or less propaganda with somewhat problematic elements. It's a fun way to read the Avengers that would loosely adapt into this story. During the end credits scene, Nick Fury talks with the recently unfrozen Steve Rogers, who's adjusting to a new world. He gives Steve his next assignment, which would be the mission from the Avengers movie. Stan Lee has a cameo as always in this, but it's pretty boring. It's just a generic general, and definitely not his most crazy cameo. Overall, it's pretty quick and basic. I think Captain America the First Avenger is a pretty decent film, mostly. It's a good coming-of-age story of sorts, and the World War II setting allows for this symbol of good to have a good, albeit fairly simple villain in Hydra and the Nazis. It's very black and white, but establishes a good superhero character despite his inherent lack of depth. It's shot well enough, and the score is actually fairly notable for once, but the Captain America stuff feels a bit breezed over towards the end of the film, not showing much besides a montage. All in all, it's a good film with some pacing flaws, but it modernizes the 1940 comics and tells them in a less racist, more epic film way. The music by Alan Silvestri I think is actually quite fitting, and I like it quite a bit. It's probably the first MCU score I actually think is fairly memorable. This film includes a one-shot. A funny thing happened on the way to Thor's hammer. It was a short where Agent Coulson goes and fights some robbers. It's kind of fun. I don't have much to say about it. Just glad it wasn't backstepping a continuity error like the one from Thor. Overall, I recommend Captain America. It's fun, fast-paced, and cool seeing World War II through the lens of the Marvel Universe. Like I said, Chris Evans embraced the role and became one of the more iconic roles in the MCU. It's fast-paced and breezy. I almost felt like the film could have stood to be a little longer to flesh out some of the battles Captain America fought in, but it's Hollywood, and especially in the early MCU, it wouldn't make much business sense for them to have this as a 2.5-hour runtime because that would be fairly risky. That said, I like it quite a bit for what it is. Next, we'll be looking at Marvel's first event film, The Avengers. It's the culmination of the last 5 films and stars all of our major heroes up to this point, and Hawkeye as well. So stay tuned for that.